In 1820, New York City was the seventh largest port in America. Not the second, not the third, seventh. Philadelphia handled more flour. Baltimore handled more tobacco. Boston handled more fish. Charleston handled more cotton. Even New Orleans, 1,000 miles from the open Atlantic, moved more goods through its wharves than Manhattan did. The wiseacres of the era looked at New York's magnificent harbor, maybe the finest natural deep-water harbor on the continent, and shrugged. Beautiful harbor, they said. Shame it's so far from anywhere that actually produces anything. A New York Times article reflecting on this era put it plainly. The future metropolis included about 150,000 population and was looked upon as a rather isolated community. Everybody admitted its splendid harbor, but there were many other harbors. The trouble with New York, said the wiseacres, was its distance from the productive districts. It never would amount to much. 10 years later, New York was number one, not by a little. By 1835, the Port of New York was handling more tonnage than Boston, Baltimore, and Philadelphia combined. By 1860, 2/3 of every import entering the United States came through New York Harbor. The city's population had quadrupled. Wall Street had become the money capital of the Western Hemisphere, and every single bit of it, the banks, the brownstones, the stock exchange, the fortunes, the skyline that would follow, traces back to one decision: to dig a ditch. Not a metaphorical ditch, a literal one, 4 feet deep, 40 feet wide, 363 miles long. They called it the Erie Canal, and before it was finished, they called it something else: madness. The man who first imagined the ditch was a flour merchant named Jesse Hawley, and when the idea came to him, he was sitting in a jail cell. Hawley had grown up in Connecticut, moved to western New York in his early 30s, and set up a business buying grain from farmers near Geneva, having it milled at Seneca Falls, and shipping the flour east to the cities on the Atlantic seaboard. It was a sound plan with one devastating flaw: the roads. The roads of early 19th century New York were not roads in any sense a modern person would recognize. They were muddy ruts in summer, frozen gullies in winter, and impassable swamps in spring. Hawley's flour spoiled in transit. His costs ate his margins. By 1806, he was bankrupt. And because this was an era when debt could put you behind bars, a judge in Ontario County sentenced him to 20 months in debtor's prison in Canandaigua. Most men would have spent those months staring at walls. Hawley spent them writing. Under the pseudonym Hercules, he produced 14 essays for a small newspaper called the Genesee Messenger, published between 1807 and 1808. The essays laid out in extraordinary detail the case for building a canal from Lake Erie to the Hudson River. He described the route. He estimated the costs. He calculated the benefits. He explained how the Mohawk River Valley, the only significant gap in the Appalachian Mountains between Georgia and the Canadian border, offered a natural corridor that no other state could match. The Creator, Hawley wrote, has done what we can reasonably ask of him. He has only left the finishing stroke to be applied by the hand of art. It was a remarkable performance for a bankrupt flour merchant writing from a jail cell. Some readers thought he was a lunatic. Others thought he was a genius. One reader in particular thought he might be on to something. His name was DeWitt Clinton, and he had been the mayor of New York City. But before Clinton could act on the idea, someone else had to reject it. In January 1809, a New York legislator named Joshua Foreman traveled to Washington to pitch the canal to President Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson had signed legislation for the national road. He understood infrastructure. Foreman explained the plan: a canal, 350 miles through the wilderness, connecting the Great Lakes to the sea. Jefferson listened politely and then delivered his verdict. It was, he said, a little short of madness to think of it at this day. Perhaps, he added, it was a very fine project that might be executed a century hence, but not now, not with federal money. Jefferson was not being unreasonable. In 1809, the longest canal in the United States was 27 miles. Hawley was proposing one that was more than 13 times longer, through territory that was largely uncharted forest, swamp, and rock. The elevation change from the Hudson River to Lake Erie was nearly 600 feet, which meant the canal would need at least 50 locks, complex stone and mortar chambers that lifted boats from one water level to another. There were no civil engineers in America. There were no engineering schools. The country had essentially no experience building anything of this scale. Clinton did not care. By 1810, he had gotten himself appointed to a new canal commission and begun lobbying the state legislature. By 1816, he had gathered over 100,000 signatures on a petition supporting the project. He drafted the New York Memorial, a document making the economic case with the kind of language that a businessman could love. The canal would, Clinton argued, create the greatest inland trade ever witnessed. New York would become the granary of the world, the emporium of commerce, the seat of manufactures, the focus of great moneyed operations. The whole island of Manhattan, he predicted, covered with inhabitants and replenished with a dense population, will constitute one vast city. It was a spectacular forecast. It was also, in 1816, easy to mock. Clinton's political enemies called the project Clinton's Folly. They called it Clinton's Big Ditch. They called it DeWitt's Ditch. The Tammany Hall machine worked to block him at every turn. President Madison vetoed a bill in 1817 that would have provided federal canal funding. Once again, New York was on its own. Clinton ran for governor on a Build the Canal platform and won. On April 15, 1817, the New York State Legislature authorized $7 million for construction. No federal money, no private partners at the start. Just the state of New York betting everything on a trench. $7 million was a staggering sum, the equivalent of hundreds of millions today, for a state whose entire annual budget was a fraction of that. The political risk was as enormous as the financial one. If the canal failed, it would bankrupt the state and destroy every career attached to it. And Clinton's enemies were watching. Martin Van Buren's Albany Regency, the political machine that would later help Van Buren reach the White House, fought Clinton at every turn. In 1822, they managed to remove him from the Canal Commission itself, a humiliation made particularly sharp by the fact that the first boats from the partially completed canal were at that very moment entering the Hudson River. Clinton had been stripped of credit for the project he had willed into existence. He won it back the old-fashioned way. He ran for governor again in 1824 and won in a landslide. When the canal opened a year later, he was the one standing on the deck of the Seneca Chief. Ground was broken on the 4th of July, 1817, near Rome, in the flat country of central New York. This was deliberate. The Canal Commission's two chief engineers, Benjamin Wright and James Geddes, were not, in fact, engineers. Wright was a county judge who had learned surveying to settle boundary disputes. Geddes was a salt manufacturer and judge from the Syracuse area who had used a surveying instrument exactly once before in his life. They knew they were amateurs, and they knew the political stakes if the project stalled early. So they started with the easiest section, a 90-mile stretch from Utica to Montezuma that was flat, the soil was deep and free of rock, and no locks would be needed. It was a place to learn, and they needed to learn fast. They hired local contractors, each of whom agreed to dig a section for a fixed price. The contractors brought their own tools, their own horses, their own men. Over 75% of the workers on the original canal were born in upstate New York, farmers who lived along the route and took canal work between harvests. The Irish immigrants who loom so large in the canal's legend came later, mostly during the enlargement projects of the 1830s and 1840s. The first workers were Americans who had never dug anything bigger than a well. They invented as they went. A local man designed a stump puller, a set of giant wheels on an axle chained to a tree stump, powered by an ox team, that could yank 40 stumps a day instead of 4. Another contractor designed a kind of primitive bulldozer, a scraper pulled by draft horses that broke up roots and moved loose clay. A fellow named Jeremiah Brainerd patented a wheelbarrow with a rounded basin that made it easier to dump. A small thing, but when you are moving dirt by the million cubic yard, a small thing matters. The most critical problem was cement. The locks and aqueducts of the canal had to be built from cut stone held together with mortar, and much of that stonework would be permanently submerged. Ordinary lime mortar dissolves underwater. What was needed was hydraulic cement, a mortar that hardened even when wet. The only known source was in Europe, and importing it would have been ruinously expensive. Wright sent a young assistant named Canvas White to England at White's own expense to study British canal engineering. White walked over 2,000 miles across the United Kingdom, sketching locks, examining construction techniques, and bringing home better surveying instruments. When he returned in 1818, he began testing local limestone deposits. Near Chittenango in Madison County, he found a particular kind of limestone that, when burned in a kiln, crushed and mixed with sand, produced a hydraulic cement that was cheaper and stronger than anything available in England. White patented it in 1820. Over 500,000 bushels of his cement were used to build the Erie Canal. The state promised him compensation for allowing its widespread use. He never received it. The middle section, 90 miles, flat and cooperative, was finished in just 3 years. On October 22, 1819, before the rest of the canal existed, the first passenger boat, the Chief Engineer, made a 30-mile round trip between Rome and Utica. The crowds along the towpath cheered like they were watching a miracle, which, in a sense, they were. A boat floating on a ribbon of water that hadn't existed 3 years earlier, moving through country that had been forest and swamp. The Canal Commission opened the section to commercial traffic immediately, collecting tolls while construction continued in both directions. It was the kind of move a modern startup founder would recognize. Ship the product before it's finished. Let the revenue build the case for more investment. The early tolls from the middle section helped quiet the political opposition that was still calling the whole enterprise Clinton's folly. Money has a way of settling arguments that rhetoric cannot. The boats themselves were purpose-built for the canal's peculiar dimensions. Freight boats were 60 feet long and 7 feet wide, just narrow enough to fit the locks, carrying up to 30 tons of cargo. Packet boats carried passengers, pulled by relay teams of horses trotting along the 10-foot wide towpath at 4 miles an hour. It was not fast, but it was smooth, reliable, and cheap. By 1825, more than 40,000 passengers had traveled the canal, many of them settlers heading west with everything they owned stacked on the deck. Aspiring merchants worked the boats selling books, watches, and fruit. Less scrupulous operators, confidence men in the parlance of the day, peddled counterfeit bills and miracle cures for foot corns. The canal became a floating marketplace, a moving street with its own economy, its own rhythms, and its own low comedy. The eastern section from Utica down to the Hudson was a different animal. The Mohawk River Valley dropped steeply through a series of natural rapids. 27 locks were required in just 50 miles. The work was brutal. Hand-cut stone, hand-mixed cement, black powder blasting through ridges of solid rock between Little Falls and Schenectady, with the inexperience of the crews leading to regular accidents and, occasionally, boulders landing on nearby houses. But it was the western section that nearly broke them. Between Rochester and Buffalo, the terrain threw everything it had at the builders. East of Rochester, the canal had to cross the deep Irondequoit Valley. The engineers built a spectacular embankment, essentially a raised roadbed of earth carrying the canal trough 70 feet above the valley floor, more than a mile long. They drove timber piles into the soft ground, laid heavy square beams across them, and lined the trough with a 3-inch layer of blue clay that a local farmer showed them could hold water. It worked. At Rochester, the canal crossed the Genesee River on a stone aqueduct that was, at the time, one of the most impressive structures in America, a bridge not for people or wagons, but for water itself, carrying the canal in a trough over the river below. The milling hamlet of Rochesterville, which James Geddes had noted on an early survey, watched the canal arrive and became almost overnight one of the fastest-growing cities in the country. Flour mills multiplied along the Genesee's Falls. By 1830, Rochester was the largest flour-producing city in America, milling the wheat that poured in from western New York's newly accessible farmland and shipping it east on the canal to Manhattan. At Lockport, 20 miles northeast of Buffalo, the canal met its greatest adversary, the Niagara Escarpment, the same massive limestone ridge that creates Niagara Falls. A wall of hard dolomitic rock, roughly 70 feet high, stood directly in the canal's path. An ordinary lock could lift a boat 10 to 15 feet. No one had ever stacked locks to climb a barrier this steep. Nathan Roberts, a former math teacher and land speculator whom Wright had hired early in the project, devised the solution. He designed a staircase of 5 consecutive locks, each built on top of the one below, rising in steps up the face of the escarpment. He doubled them, 2 parallel flights side by side, so east and westbound traffic could pass simultaneously. It was the most ambitious lock construction attempted in the New World, and the town that grew around it took the only possible name, Lockport. But the locks were only half the problem. Beyond them, the canal had to be blasted through 3 miles of solid rock to reach the level of Lake Erie. 1,200 workers, mostly Irish by this point, attacked the rock with black powder, pickaxes, and fire, building bonfires against the stone face, heating it until it cracked, then dousing it with cold water to split it apart. Special tower cranes hauled out the rubble. The work was lethally dangerous. Workers died from premature blasts, from falling stone, from cave-ins. The contractors kept the whiskey flowing. In 1822, a violent riot broke out between Northern Irish Protestants and Southern Irish Catholics, the tensions of the old country detonating in the rock dust of a construction site in upstate New York. When the deep cut was finally completed, many of those Irish workers stayed. Lockport became one of the most proudly Irish towns in western New York, built by the men who had blasted its reason for existing out of the earth. The whole canal was finished on October 26, 1825, 2 years ahead of schedule under the original $7 million budget. The celebration that followed was unlike anything America had ever seen. That morning in the small frontier village of Buffalo, population about 2,400, Governor Clinton boarded a packet boat called the Seneca Chief. He carried with him 2 wooden casks filled with water from Lake Erie. A team of white horses, brightly decorated, pulled the boat away from its moorings. A cannon fired. And then something happened that, in the age before the telegraph, was the fastest communication Americans had ever experienced. Cannoneers had been stationed along the entire length of the canal, each within earshot of the next. When the first cannon fired at Buffalo, the next man down the line fired his, then the next, then the next. The chain of explosions raced east along the canal to Albany, and then south down the Hudson River to New York City. 380 miles of cannon fire, relayed from one artilleryman to the next. The sound reached Manhattan in approximately 90 minutes. Then the chain reversed. The cannons fired back, west to east, all the way back to Buffalo. The round trip took roughly 3 hours. An entire state had been stitched together by sound. Clinton's flotilla took 10 days to make the trip, stopping at nearly every town along the way for parades, speeches, and cannon salutes. When the Seneca Chief finally reached New York Harbor on November 4th, tens of thousands of people lined the waterfront. Steamboats towed the canal boats into the harbor. A massive flotilla gathered. Clinton lifted one of his casks over his head and poured Lake Erie water into the Atlantic Ocean. They called it the Wedding of the Waters, the moment the interior of the continent married the sea. Within a year, 42 horse and mule-drawn barges a day were moving toward New York City, loaded with timber, grain, flour, and whiskey. 435,000 gallons of whiskey in the first year alone. In that first year, 2,000 boats, 9,000 horses, and 8,000 men were working the canal. A new industry had been born overnight, complete with its own labor force, its own supply chains, its own culture. Towns along the canal that had been crossroads hamlets became commercial stops, their taverns and warehouses suddenly busy with boatmen, merchants, and travelers. The economics were staggering. Before the canal, shipping a ton of goods overland from Buffalo to New York cost $100 and took 2 to 3 weeks. After the canal, the same ton cost $6 to $10 and took 6 days. A 90% reduction in cost, a 60% reduction in time. In one stroke, every farmer west of Albany could suddenly reach the markets of the eastern seaboard, and beyond them, the markets of Europe. The toll revenue was immediate. In 1835 alone, the canal collected $1.5 million in tolls. By 1847, that figure had risen to $3.33 million. The entire $7 million construction debt was erased within 9 years. By the time tolls were finally abolished in 1882, the canal had generated $121 million in revenue on a $7 million investment. It may have been the most profitable public infrastructure project in American history. But the tolls were the smallest part of the story. The real transformation happened at the mouth of the canal in Manhattan. Before the canal, New York City's merchants had no particular advantage over their rivals in Philadelphia, Boston, or Baltimore. All 4 cities had good harbors. All 4 had established commercial networks. The problem for all of them was the same: the Appalachian Mountains. The mountain chain ran like a wall from Georgia to Maine, separating the coastal cities from the rich farmland and timber of the interior. Whichever city found a way through that wall first would capture the trade of the entire American West. Geography gave New York one advantage that no amount of money could buy Philadelphia or Baltimore. The Mohawk River Valley was the only natural gap in the Appalachians wide enough and low enough in elevation to allow a water-level route from the coast to the interior. Philadelphia had the Alleghenies to cross, rugged mountains that topped 2,000 feet. Baltimore had the same problem. Both cities would eventually try to build their own canals and fail. Pennsylvania's portage and canal system was a Rube Goldberg contraption that required boats to be hauled overland on rail inclines over the mountain summits. It was expensive, slow, and never competitive. Baltimore's canal project was abandoned outright. Virginia's dream of extending the Potomac, the same canal George Washington had championed, ran out of money and geography alike. Only New York had the Mohawk Gap, and now only New York had a canal running through it. The results were immediate and lopsided. In 1820, the year before the canal's middle section opened, New York was a distant third to Baltimore and Philadelphia in flour exports, handling just 267,000 barrels to Baltimore's 577,000. By 1827, 2 years after the canal's full opening, New York was the runaway leader. In 1821, the first year for which import statistics survive, New York handled just over a third of all American imports. By 1860, it handled more than 2/3, with 6 times the imports of second-place Boston. The poet Oliver Wendell Holmes, watching it happen, described New York as the tongue that is licking up the cream of commerce of a continent. The historian of the city of Philadelphia, writing decades later, condensed the whole catastrophe into one blunt observation. Money gathers at New York, he wrote, because the products are there. Transportation is king. Philadelphia tried to fight back with its Pennsylvania portage and canal system, a tortured contraption that required canal boats to be loaded onto railroad cars, hauled over the Allegheny summit on inclined planes, and reloaded on the other side. It was completed in 1834, 9 years after the Erie opened, and it was immediately, hopelessly outclassed. Baltimore tried, too, launching the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal to follow Washington's old dream of a Potomac route to the west. It ran out of money in the mountains of western Maryland and never reached the Ohio River. Neither city ever recovered its position. By 1860, the Port of New York had a population of 3.5 million, and combined exports and imports valued at nearly $1.25 billion. Philadelphia had 1/3 the population and 1/10 the trade. And here is where the canal's legacy becomes something larger than transportation. The flood of western grain and lumber pouring into New York Harbor created a problem that, in solving, gave birth to modern American finance. Upstate farmers harvested their grain in the fall, but by the time it was milled into flour, the canal had frozen over. They couldn't ship until spring, but they needed money immediately for milling costs, for winter storage, for seed to plant in the spring. New York City's produce merchants saw the opportunity and became, in effect, bankers. They loaned farmers a portion of the purchase price months in advance, secured against the flour that would arrive when the ice broke. It was commodity financing, improvised in real time by grain traders who needed to guarantee their supply. Meanwhile, the state of New York was issuing bonds to fund the canal's construction, and those bonds needed buyers. In 1819, the state legislature chartered the New York Savings Bank, a new institution designed to encourage thrift among working-class New Yorkers. Restricted by law to investing only in government securities, the bank immediately began buying canal bonds. By 1821, the Savings Bank held nearly 30% of all outstanding canal loans. By 1833, it was the canal's single largest investor. Working-class depositors in Lower Manhattan were, without quite knowing it, funding the infrastructure that was making their city rich. The canal bonds proved spectacularly reliable. When the Panic of 1837 hit, a devastating financial crisis that destroyed banks across the country, New York State, sitting on low debt and fat canal revenues, met all its obligations without difficulty. Wall Street banks survived. Philadelphia's financial institutions did not fare as well. The capital of American finance, which had been Philadelphia since Alexander Hamilton chartered the Bank of the United States there in 1791, shifted to New York. It never shifted back. The New York Stock and Exchange Board, founded in 1817, the same year construction on the canal began, turned a handsome profit financing canal operations and then pivoted to the next great infrastructure play, the railroads. The symbiosis between a waterway upstate and a financial district downtown was so tight, so reinforcing, that separating them is impossible. The canal made Wall Street, and Wall Street financed the canal. The canal also remade the map of New York State. Every major city in the state, with only two exceptions, Binghamton and Elmira, sits on the trade route established by the canal. Rochester grew from a milling hamlet to a boom town. Syracuse, built near the salt springs that James Geddes had once manufactured, became a manufacturing center. Buffalo, the canal's western terminus, exploded from a frontier settlement of 200 in 1820 to over 18,000 by 1840. Two villages, Black Rock and Buffalo, had competed bitterly to be named the terminus. Black Rock lost. Within 30 years, Buffalo had annexed it. Nearly 80% of upstate New York's population still lives within 25 miles of the canal. And then there were the effects nobody anticipated. Evangelical preachers traveled the canal, creating what became known as the Burned-Over District, a stretch of western New York so swept by religious revivals that it was said the fires of the Spirit had burned through every available soul. Mormonism was born along the canal corridor. The spiritualist movement took root there. The abolitionist and women's suffrage movements found fertile ground. The canal carried ideas as efficiently as it carried grain. The canal even shaped the Civil War, though nobody planned it that way. For 35 years before the first shots at Fort Sumter, the Erie Canal had been pulling the economy of the Midwest, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, away from the Mississippi and toward New York. Grain that once flowed south to New Orleans now flowed east to Albany. Manufactured goods that once came upriver from Louisiana now came west from Manhattan. The commercial ties, the social connections, the daily economic gravity of the canal bound the Midwest to the Northeast so tightly that when secession came, the states along the Great Lakes chose union almost without hesitation. If the canal had never been built, if Midwestern commerce had continued to follow the Mississippi to New Orleans, political sympathies in those states might have looked very different. A ditch 4 feet deep may have helped hold the country together. It also carried disease. Smallpox and cholera rode the canal boats from town to town, and the canal's critics grew to loathe the whole canal culture, the rough boatman, the whiskey, the occasional violence at the locks when boats jostled for position. During the years of construction, more than 1,000 men reportedly died of malaria in the Montezuma Marsh west of Syracuse, a mosquito-infested swamp through which the canal had to be threaded. The workers called it a graveyard. The engineers called it a necessary stretch. The canal was a conduit in every sense, for commerce and for contagion, for ambition and for misery alike. The volume of goods tells the story in pure numbers. In 1829, 4 years after the canal opened, 3,640 bushels of wheat were transported from Buffalo. By 1837, that figure had reached 500,000 bushels. 4 years after that, 1 million. By 1845, the canal was carrying 1 million tons of goods per year. Within a few years of its opening, the canal moved freight worth double the value of everything shipped down the Mississippi to New Orleans. The whole commerce of the American interior had shifted its axis from south-north to west-east because of a trench through the Mohawk Valley. For 30 years, nothing could touch the Erie Canal. But in 1842, a continuous rail line opened from Albany to Buffalo, the route that would become the New York Central Railroad. At first, the canal held its own. Barges were slower but far cheaper per ton. The canal was enlarged between 1836 and 1862, widened to 70 feet and deepened to 7. Its locks doubled and rebuilt, its aqueducts replaced with massive stone arches designed to last generations. The men who built the enlarged canal clearly believed it would endure. The peak year was 1855, when 33,000 commercial shipments moved along its waters. But the railroads kept getting faster, cheaper, and less dependent on season. Canals froze, trains did not. Canals followed river valleys, trains could climb mountains. The same engineering talent that the Erie Canal had trained, the graduates of what became known as the Erie School of Engineering, went on to build the railroads that would eventually make the canal obsolete. Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, one of the first engineering schools in America, was founded in 1824 in Troy, right alongside the canal. It produced the men who built the iron roads that drained the canal's traffic. Tolls were abolished in 1882, a tacit admission that the canal could no longer compete on its own terms. In 1903, New York voters authorized $101 million for a massive overhaul. The old canal was rerouted, widened, and deepened into the New York State Barge Canal, completed in 1918. Rivers that the original builders had carefully avoided, the Mohawk, the Seneca, the Clyde, were dredged and dammed and incorporated into the new waterway, which could now handle barges carrying 3,000 tons. But the rebuilding bypassed the centers of the cities the canal had created. The waterway that had given Rochester and Syracuse their reason for being was now routed around them. The barge canal limped along through the 20th century. There is a particular irony in what killed it. The completion of the New York State Thruway in 1956, an interstate highway that follows almost exactly the route of the original canal, exploiting the same Mohawk Valley gap that Jesse Hawley had identified from his prison cell, drained what commercial traffic remained. The highway that the state built to replace the canal followed the canal's own path. The logic of geography does not change. Only the technology running through it does. The opening of the St. Lawrence Seaway in 1959 which allowed ocean-going ships to reach the Great Lakes directly, rendered the canal essentially redundant for heavy freight. The last regularly scheduled commercial hauler on the canal, a vessel called the Day Peckinpah, made its final run in 1994. In 2008, there were 42 commercial shipments on the canal. In its peak year, there had been 33,000. Today, the Erie Canal is primarily a recreational waterway. Cyclists ride the canalway trail along its banks. Kayakers paddle through the old locks. Museums in Syracuse and Lockport tell the story of the men who dug it. Over 1.5 million people visit every year, many of them arriving by car on the thruway that paved over the canal's legacy. And in Manhattan, the harbor that was once the 7th busiest in America, the harbor that the wiseacre said would never amount to much, still holds the financial district that canal revenue built. The New York Stock Exchange still stands on the street where brokers first traded canal bonds under a buttonwood tree. The savings banks that bought those bonds still have descendants operating in the city. The commodity markets that grew out of grain futures trading still set global prices. The whole elaborate machinery of American capital sits on an island at the mouth of a river that leads, if you follow it far enough north and then turn left, to a trench in the earth 4 feet deep and 40 feet wide, dug by farmers and judges and math teachers who had never built anything before and who bet everything on a ditch that a president called madness. Jesse Hawley lived to see it. Released from debtor's prison around 1808, he eventually settled in Lockport, the town that Nathan Roberts' Staircase of Locks had conjured into existence. He served a term in the New York State Assembly. He became the village treasurer. On October 26, 1825, the day the canal opened, Governor Clinton invited Hawley to deliver the opening address at the celebration in Buffalo. The bankrupt flour merchant who had dreamed up the canal from a jail cell stood before the crowd and watched the Seneca chief pull away from the dock, carrying a cask of lake water toward the sea. Hawley died on January 10, 1842, at the age of 68 in Lockport. He is buried in Cold Spring Cemetery, a few hundred yards from the canal his essays brought into being. By that time, 1 million tons of goods a year were moving on the water he had imagined. New York City was the largest port in the Western Hemisphere. Wall Street was the money capital of the nation. And the ditch, 4 feet deep, 40 feet wide, running through the only gap in the mountains, was still carrying the cream of a continent toward the sea.